Most people have no idea what's about to happen. After this, Trump-Iran ultimatum. Something shifted over the weekend that most people have not fully processed yet. While the news cycle moved on to sports scores and weekend weather, the President of the United States posted a message on social media that could alter the price of everything in your grocery cart, put American service members in direct danger, and pull the Middle East into a confrontation the region has not seen in decades. Not a press briefing, not an Oval Office address, a social media post. And it came with a deadline. This is the story of that ultimatum, where it came from, what it actually demands, why the timing matters more than most analysts are saying, and what the three possible outcomes look like when the clock runs out. Because here is the thing, the headline is the ultimatum, but the real story is the architecture of decisions that made this moment possible and how dangerously narrow the exits have become. On the night of Saturday, March 22nd, at 23:44 GMT, President Donald Trump posted a direct warning to the government of Iran. The language was not ambiguous. The United States, he stated, would strike and obliterate Iranian power plants, beginning with the largest one first, unless Iran fully reopened the Strait of Hormuz within 48 hours. That deadline lands somewhere around Monday night, March 24th. 90 million people live on the other side of that threat. And the waterway at the center of it all carries roughly 1/5 of the world's entire oil supply every single day. Before we get to what happens next, we need to understand what got us here. Because this ultimatum did not arrive in a vacuum. It arrived at the end of a chain of decisions, some deliberate, some improvised, some that now look impossible to reverse. And each link in that chain has narrowed the range of choices available to every actor in this crisis. Go back to February 6th of this year. Representatives from the United States and Iran were sitting in Geneva, Switzerland, with Omani diplomats in the room as mediators, attempting to negotiate the outlines of a new nuclear framework. The talks were slow. They were indirect. They were, by any honest account, unglamorous work. But diplomacy of that kind, quiet, painstaking, carried out by people whose names you will never know, is precisely the kind of work that prevents the alternative. By February 28th, those talks were still technically ongoing, and then they weren't. On that date, the United States and Israel launched what officials described as Operation Epic Fury. The scale was staggering. Nearly 900 strikes executed across Iran in approximately 12 hours. Targets included military installations, air defense systems, command infrastructure, and sites associated with Iran's broader strategic deterrence capability. Iran's supreme leader was killed in the operation. A new leadership structure took shape in the immediate aftermath. And just like that, in the span of a single day, the architecture of a diplomatic process that had taken months to construct was replaced by the most significant American military operation in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. What followed was not de-escalation. By early March, Iran had effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz, not symbolically, not partially. It restricted the flow of commercial shipping through a waterway that the global economy depends on, with a dependency that is not theoretical. The Strait of Hormuz sits between the Omani coast and the Iranian shoreline, at its narrowest point only about 21 nautical miles wide. Through that corridor passes the oil exports of Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Qatar. When that corridor closes, the global energy market does not adapt smoothly. It panics. Within days of the restriction, Brent crude oil prices crossed $105 per barrel. American gasoline prices, which had been sitting at approximately $2.94 per gallon nationally before the operation began, climbed to $3.93 per gallon. That is a $1 increase in a matter of weeks. For context, that kind of price movement does not hit every American equally. It hits the people driving to hourly wage jobs the hardest. It hits the small business owner whose shipping costs just spiked. It hits the family already stretching a budget that had no room to stretch further. That dollar is a real cost being paid by real people, while the decisions that caused it are made thousands of miles away with no accountability mechanism visible to the public. Meanwhile, the human cost inside Iran has continued to accumulate. By the time the ultimatum was posted, more than 5,300 people had been killed since the start of Operation Epic Fury, over 500 of them documented civilians. And in the days immediately preceding the ultimatum, Iranian missile systems that American and Israeli operations had supposedly degraded, struck southern Israel, injuring more than 100 people, including a 10-year-old child. That strike demonstrated something important: the assumption that Iran's offensive capabilities had been sufficiently neutralized was either premature, or the definition of degraded was being applied very loosely. And here is where the internal contradiction starts to become impossible to ignore. Just one day before the 48-hour ultimatum was posted, President Trump stated publicly that the United States was winding down the conflict. Those were the Friday talking points. By Saturday night, the language had shifted to threatening the obliteration of power generation infrastructure, serving a civilian population of 90 million people. What changed between Friday and Saturday? What intelligence assessment was updated? What battlefield development altered the calculus so completely that a narrative of de-escalation transformed overnight into one of maximalist threat? None of that has been publicly explained. No press conference was held. No National Security Council briefing was provided to congressional leadership. No call was placed to allied governments, whose energy security is directly tied to the Strait of Hormuz. The ultimatum was posted on social media, and the deadlines started running. Now let us look carefully at what the ultimatum actually demands, because the language matters enormously when you are trying to understand whether compliance is even operationally feasible. The president's statement demanded that Iran fully open without threat the Strait of Hormuz within 48 hours. That phrase sounds straightforward. It is not. By the time the ultimatum was issued, the strait had mines laid across portions of its navigable shipping lanes. Iranian military units retained positioning along the coastline. Coastal infrastructure used for targeting and surveillance had been damaged but not eliminated. Admiral Brad Cooper, the senior U.S. military commander at Central Command, stated in a briefing just hours before the ultimatum that Iran's ability to target vessels had been degraded. That word carries a precise meaning in military planning. It does not mean eliminated. It does not mean neutralized. It means reduced. So the question becomes, if American military commanders are themselves using the word degraded to describe the current threat environment in the strait, then the demand for Iran to fully open without threat may be asking for a condition that is not achievable within 48 hours, regardless of Iranian intent. You cannot remove mines from a strait in 2 days. You cannot restore civilian shipping confidence through an active conflict zone on a 48-hour clock. Even a fully cooperative Iran, a hypothetical that strains credulity given the current state of the conflict, could not realistically produce the operational outcome the ultimatum demands on the timeline specified. This gap between the stated demand and the operational reality creates a problem that extends far beyond strategy. It creates a credibility trap. Either the ultimatum is enforced, with all the consequences that follow, or it is not enforced, and every adversary watching, and they are all watching, draws their own conclusion about what American warnings are worth going forward. There is no version of this that does not carry cost. The international legal dimension of what is being threatened adds another layer of complexity that cannot be dismissed. The specific targets mentioned, power plants, are not military installations. They are civilian infrastructure. Iran's largest power plant serves hospitals, water treatment systems, residential neighborhoods, and industrial facilities occupied by civilians with no military affiliation. Under the Geneva Conventions, specifically Protocol Y, Article 54, attacking objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population is subject to severe restrictions under the laws of armed conflict. This is not a hypothetical legal debate. These are binding frameworks to which the United States is a signatory. Threatening to strike such targets as the explicitly stated primary objective places the United States in territory that its own legal frameworks and military doctrine have historically treated as prohibited. The allies most directly exposed to the consequences of this crisis were not consulted before the ultimatum was issued. Countries in the Gulf Cooperation Council, The UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain depend on the Strait of Hormuz for the export of their energy production. They also host American military installations. American service members are stationed on bases in those countries right now. When Iran responded to the ultimatum by warning that it would target energy and desalination infrastructure belonging to the United States and its regional partners, those were not abstract threats. They were threats directed at facilities where American personnel are physically present and at the water supply systems of Gulf states that support tens of millions of civilians. Those allied governments learned about the ultimatum the same way most of the world did, by reading it after the fact. No calls preceded it. No coordination was attempted. No joint framework was established. Nations that have aligned their strategic interests with Washington for decades, that have opened their territory to American forces, that have adjusted their own foreign policies in consultation with American administrations. They were presented with a public ultimatum and asked to absorb the consequences without any input in the decision. That is not how alliances function. It is not how they survive pressure. The effect of that approach reaches far beyond the immediate crisis. When the United States acts in ways that its closest partners cannot anticipate, it does not project strength to its adversaries. It projects instability. And instability in the strategic calculus of powers like Russia and China is an invitation, not a deterrent. Moscow watches Washington's allies being bypassed and draws conclusions about the durability of the Western coalition. Beijing watches the Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 17% of China's oil imports flow, become a hostage in a bilateral confrontation it had no role in creating, and recalibrates accordingly. These shifts do not make headlines today, but they shape the geopolitical landscape for years. Back in Washington, the constitutional dimension of this crisis has been accumulating pressure since the operation began. When Operation Epic Fury was launched on February 28th, Congress was not asked for authorization. The administration relied on executive authority to conduct what is, by any reasonable definition, a major act of war against a sovereign nation. On March 4th, the House of Representatives attempted to pass a war powers resolution. That resolution failed. On March 18th, the Senate made a similar attempt. It was blocked. The result is that the United States has been engaged in active combat operations against Iran for nearly 4 weeks without a single congressional vote authorizing that engagement. The War Powers Resolution of 1973 was designed specifically to prevent this scenario. It has not prevented it. And the ultimatum issued Saturday night represents a potential escalation of that unauthorized engagement into a qualitatively more severe phase, one with far greater humanitarian consequences and a far smaller margin for error. The economic consequences are no longer a future risk. They are already materializing. Shipping insurance rates for vessels transiting the Persian Gulf have increased by margins analysts describe as historically severe. Container shipping companies are rerouting cargo around the Arabian Peninsula via the Cape of Good Hope, adding between 7 and 14 days to transit times and dramatically increasing fuel costs per voyage. Those costs get passed on through goods pricing, freight surcharges, and inflation data that central banks will be reviewing in the weeks ahead. The Federal Reserve, which had been navigating a careful path between controlling inflation and avoiding recession, now faces an external shock absent from any of its baseline projections 6 weeks ago. Now let us talk about what actually happens when the clock runs out. Because the deadline matters, and the range of outcomes is genuinely consequential. 3 scenarios emerge from the current situation. In the first, Iran offers partial compliance. It may allow limited resumption of commercial shipping under specific conditions, perhaps civilian vessels only, or with assurances that stop short of full renunciation of defensive posture. The administration, facing the alternative of striking civilian power infrastructure, chooses to frame partial compliance as progress and quietly extends or softens the deadline. The news cycle moves on. The underlying conflict continues unresolved. The mines remain in the water. The military units along the coastline remain positioned. The structural conditions that produce the crisis persist. The next confrontation is deferred, not prevented. This may be the most probable scenario in the immediate term. It also resolves the least. In the second scenario, Iran does not comply, and the administration follows through on what it has publicly stated. American strikes hit Iranian power generation infrastructure. Electricity across a significant portion of a country of 90 million people goes dark. Hospitals operate on emergency backup systems. Water treatment facilities lose power. Iran retaliates not just against Israel, but against energy infrastructure across the Gulf. Refineries, desalination plants, distribution hubs. Oil prices do not simply rise in this scenario. Analysts who have modeled comparable historical supply disruptions suggest prices could surge past $150 per barrel within days of initial strikes, with some projections extending beyond $200 if the disruption spreads and sustains. At that price point, the global economic calculation changes entirely. What began as a bilateral confrontation becomes a systemic shock to the world economy, with no coalition framework to manage it, no congressional mandate to legitimize it, and no exit strategy visible from the outside. The third scenario is the most quietly damaging and the one receiving the least attention. The deadline passes. The United States does not strike. The ultimatum expires without consequence. Every adversary that has been watching absorbs a specific lesson that ultimatums issued under these conditions do not necessarily mean what they say. That lesson does not stay confined to this crisis. It travels into every future negotiation, every future deterrence moment, every future calculation about whether American warnings carry weight. Credibility, once spent this way, is extraordinarily difficult to recover. The cost of Scenario 3 is not measured in immediate casualties or price spikes. It is measured in the slow erosion of the deterrence architecture that American foreign policy has depended on for decades, and the compounding vulnerability that erosion creates over time. What makes this situation so sobering is that all three outcomes leave the strategic position of the United States worse than it was before the ultimatum was posted. The ultimatum does not offer a path to resolution. It offers a forced choice between three forms of damage: immediate military escalation with cascading regional consequences, systemic economic disruption, or credibility collapse with long-term strategic costs. And the choice between them is being made under a 48-hour clock, without allied input, without congressional authorization, and without a publicly stated endgame that any of the involved parties have agreed to. The humanitarian dimension of what is being threatened must be acknowledged clearly and without dramatization. The people living near Iran's power generation infrastructure are not combatants. The hospitals depending on continuous electricity to maintain surgical suites, intensive care units, and medical refrigeration are not military assets. The water treatment systems providing safe drinking water to urban populations are not legitimate targets under any legal standard the United States has historically endorsed. The consequences of striking them would be immediate and measurable. Power outages in a country of 90 million people, disrupted emergency medical care, contaminated water supplies, and those consequences would be documented and transmitted globally in real time, shaping the international perception of American conduct in ways that no subsequent statement could fully undo. That reputational cost does not stay in the Middle East. It follows American diplomacy into every room it enters for years. Beyond Iran's borders, the regional risk calculus has shifted for every government watching this unfold. Every actor in the broader Middle East is making contingency calculations based on what happens when that deadline expires. Countries hosting American forces are weighing risk to their own populations. Nations dependent on Gulf energy exports are watching their economic security become a variable in a confrontation they had no hand in creating. Several signals will indicate which scenario is materializing. Watch Iranian state communications. If they begin signaling willingness to discuss conditions for the strait's reopening, partial compliance is being tested. If they escalate retaliatory rhetoric with no reference to any diplomatic opening, the stakes rise significantly. Watch the Gulf states. If Qatar, the UAE, or Saudi Arabia makes public statements urging de-escalation, their private assessments are showing them something alarming. Watch U.S. military posture. Carrier group positioning and logistics deployments near Iranian waters will carry information that official statements may not. Watch energy futures markets. They will have already priced in which scenario decision-makers are taking most seriously. What has fundamentally changed, not in the last 48 hours, but over the course of the last 4 weeks, is the institutional framework within which this crisis is being managed. A month ago, the United States was the actor in global affairs whose predictability, whose commitment to process, and whose willingness to build coalitions provided a stabilizing function in moments when the international system was under pressure. That role is not gone, but it is under visible strain, and the strain is not coming from adversaries applying external pressure. It is coming from internal decisions about how power is exercised, and without what checks, and through what channels. Those decisions carry consequences that extend far beyond the outcome of this particular ultimatum. The ultimatum is the event, the condition that made it possible, the compression of deliberative process, the bypassing of institutional consultation, the collapse of the distance between political communication and strategic action. That condition is what will determine what the post-crisis world looks like, however this specific crisis resolves. Because international relationships, deterrence credibility, and alliance trust are built over years and lost in days. What is being tested right now is not simply whether Iran will open a waterway. What is being tested is whether the architecture of accountability that governs how the world's most powerful country goes to war still functions as designed. Pay close attention. The response, or the absence of one, will tell the world something no subsequent statement can unsay. This report is based on observable developments and strategic analysis, with some details still evolving as events continue to unfold.